we need to get a taxation system at the international level which is fair and equitable for all countries. And I hope that this discussion will contribute to reach that aim. The second concept in the title of this webinar is about the SDGs, the impact of taxation on SDGs. As we know, the achievement of SDGs has been hit tremendously by COVID-19. A lot of progress made has been lost in the last few months. And certainly developing countries need to mobilize internal resources through taxation in order to be able to come back to a path of achieving the SDG. So I think these two concepts in the title of this webinar are really very telling about the content of the discussions that will take place. We are also very privileged to have speakers, two members of the UN Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters. So thank you very much for the speakers. It's a real honor to have you. The South Center in its tax project is working in order to have concrete proposals. That's one particular objective that the tax initiative has at the South Center, to be concrete, to be able to move forward the agenda for developing countries to participate actively in these discussions. And the second objective is to try and get a common view, a common position by developing countries that will strengthen the capacity to influence the outcomes of this discussion. So this is tremendously important, because we know on the side of OECD, developed countries, they are very well organized. They have a very strong support from many institutions, and developing countries need to act together in order to be able to influence and have their interests reflected in the reform of the international taxation system. Well, with this, let me just again welcome you all and thank our partners for co-organizing this meeting. I hope you will be able to discuss in detail and help us and participants and developing countries' governments to define an agenda that will get us to our objective, which is a fair international taxation system that will support the interests of developing countries. Of course, discussion about taxation, digital economy will be one important part of these debates. This is extremely important. The South Center has published recently a document on this that already provides information about measures adopted by a number of countries. So this is not just propaganda, it's just that we really feel that this is an important issue that needs to be taken very seriously as a priority agenda by our governments. So thank you very much. So I'll leave you with Chancellor of the University of Mysore.
Yeah, he will soon join, Dr. Korea. I'll ask our colleague from the Mandya Center, Dr. Prem Kumar, on behalf of the Mandya Center, to welcome the audience.
Great.
Prem Kumar. Prem Kumar.
Thank you very much, sir. Nahi jnanena sadrishyam. Nothing equals knowledge. This is the slogan of University of Mysore. For today's seminar, we have participants across the globe, from UK, US, Europe, South African countries, and from Asia, and from all the states of India. So, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening all. I, Dr. Prema Kumara, GS, Professor of Economics, Department of Economics, Sir M.V. Postgraduate Center, University of Mysore. On behalf of the South Center, Geneva, the Sustainability Platform, Asia, Indian Economic Association, and University of Mysore, inviting and welcoming for this international virtual seminar on the equity in global tax regimes and implications for the sustainable development goals. I am extremely happy and delighted to welcome the patrons, resource persons, moderators, conveners, organizing secretaries, and participants. Respected friends and senior academicians, we have given the web link for the bios of our patrons and resource persons. And we also given the web link for all the 4 institutions. Please click on the links. You will get the detailed information about our patrons resource persons, and institutions. Thus, I am going to briefly introduce our patrons and resource persons and welcome them. The South Center is the intergovernmental organization of developing countries that helps developing countries to combine their efforts and expertise to promote their common interests in the international arena. Dr. Carlos Maria Correa, the Executive Director of the South Center. Carlos Maria Correa began his term as South Center Executive Director on 1st July 2018. Dr. Correa is a renowned international authority on international property and technology issues. I am extremely happy that Dr. Carlos agreed to preside over this seminar and be part of the seminar as a host. Respected sir, I am delighted to welcome you, sir. Welcome you, sir. University of Mysore is known for its academic excellence and having international reputations. Professor G. Hemant Kumar is the Vice Chancellor of University of Mysore. Our Honorable Vice Chancellor, basically a trained, renowned computer science professor, a successful academician, completed hundreds crores worth of projects, published more than 448 research papers with 1,446 scientific citations and H-index 24. Our Vice Chancellor is member of many scientific societies like Indian Society for Technical Education, Computer Society of India, Indian Science Congress, Association, and many more. Professor has widely traveled for academic and administrative purposes. Apart from this, our Vice Chancellor is an efficient, excellent, and successful administrator, always supports academic endeavors, and agreed to give inaugural speech in this evening. With this brief introduction, I heartily welcome our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor G. Hemant Kumar. Welcome you, sir. I also welcome Professor B.P. Chandramohan, General Secretary, Indian Economic Association. Due to unavoidable commitments, Professor is not attending the seminar, and his responsibilities will be shouldered by Dr. Anil Kumar Thakur or Nasir Khan. I am happy to welcome both Dr. Anil Kumar Thakur and Nasir Khan. Two resource persons, Mr. Eric Mensah, Co-Chairperson, United Nations Committee of Experts on International Cooperation in Tax Matters, and Mr. Carlos Preto, Director of International Tax Relations, Ministry of Treasury, Argentina, have accepted our invitation and agreed to give their expertise to this seminar. On behalf of all the four institutions, I wholeheartedly welcome Mr. Eric Mensah and Mr. Carlos Preto. Welcome you, sir, both of you. Three masterminds of this seminar are Professor Lawrence Surendra, Council Member, TSP Asia, the Sustainability Platform; Mr. Abdul Mohit Chowdhury, Senior Program Officer, South Center, Tax Initiatives, Geneva; Ms. Jhanjeb Akhtar, Principal Commissioner of Tax, India, have designed and executed this program. Without their support and involvement, this program would not be realized. Professor Lawrence will give Mr. Abdul and Ms. Jhanjeb will moderate the seminar. I heartily welcome Professor Lawrence, Mr. Abdul, Ms. Jhanjeb. I request Professor Lawrence to, I will heartily welcome all the three. Thank you, sir. Welcome you, sir. I welcome Professor H.R. Uma, convener of this seminar. Welcome you, ma'am. I also welcome organizing secretary of this seminar, Dr. K. Sivachitappa, professor and coordinator, Department of Economics, Sarami PG Center, University of Mysore. I also welcome the director of Sarami PG Center, University of Mysore, Professor Vijay Sheshadri. Welcome you, sir. I also welcome our own colleagues, Dr. Kiran, Shivanna, and others for this seminar. It is my bounden duty to welcome all the participants and technical team, particularly Rajgopal, Chandranayak, Manjunath, Devender to this seminar. Once again, I welcome you all.
Yeah. I think the VC will now speak, Honorable VC. Correct, Martira?
Very good evening to you all. I'm very happy to inaugurate this international virtual seminar on equity in global tax regimes and implications for the SDGs. Professor B.P. Chandramohan, Professor Carlos, and HR Uma, Professor K. Shivchittappa, Nazir Khan, Sri Prem Kumar, and all other organizers and resource persons who are present here, and many research scholars, students, and also participants who are virtually present, and media personnel. I am very happy to be here. I consider it as an honor to make this presidential remark in this international virtual seminar. The very eminent scientists and social scientists and economists have been a part of the faculty of the University of Mysore, one of the oldest university and prestigious universities. It is therefore very appropriate we should possibly be the first university in India to collaborate with such a international prestigious center, intergovernmental center of as the South Center, which has the headquarters in Genoa. And on very important topic in the world context, what we are today, and at the in the midst, the major global public health crisis and also triggering deep economic and social crisis is in its wake. We are deeply grateful to the sustainable platform of Platform Asia, a unique public policy think tank with a unique pool of intellectual and practical resources focused on enhancing the intellectual capacity and practical and academic competency in our higher educational institutions, for agreeing to assist our colleagues in designing and executing this seminar for the benefit of teachers and also young scientists. I congratulate all my colleagues for the Faculty of Economics and of the Postgraduate Center in Mandya, which is situated in rural area, and taking initiative and putting together in this collaboration with IEA. I am particularly happy to our center that is in rural area taking initiative for international seminar, and because all often digital activities, especially nowadays, we are resulting digital exclusion for our less privileged citizens than our rural and hinterlands. As a computer scientist myself, engaged in the digital cooperation with the university globally, I appreciate the fact that digital medium today is utilized with the care, and see that how this meaningful content and relevance is used as a criteria. Now we shall see too often, just because the online digital technology is available, all kinds of online seminar without throughout we are conducting the online seminar, or the care being taken, the wasting of both human resource, time and energy. We are saving time and energy because of these online seminars. The international virtual seminar, on the other hand, demonstrates how with the care and thought the virtual seminars can be larger, so it can give a larger social impact. Many organizations think that now we are not spending the money on travel and reducing our carbon footprint, and though what we call online seminars, we are contributing the conservation of energy. It is not, we are told that internet would demonstrate the society and decrease the energy use, but on the contrary, on this projection, it has become what we call large and rapidly growing consumer energy itself. Accordingly, to the latest estimates, the entire network is already 10% of the global electricity production, with the data trafficking is doubled in every 2 years. Let me end with an assuring that the Social Center and TSP Asia, as a Vice Chancellor of University of Mysore, I do not see our cooperation as the ending in the virtual seminar. I see it as a beginning of larger fruitful cooperation for the benefit of the teaching and learning community and society. And globally, we do look forward you to guide and advise the ideas on concreting the long-term cooperation, especially in promoting UN sustainable development goals. And also I assure that I look forward to such cooperation with concrete and practical outcomes with your wisdom and guidance and competence. I am happy to offer our university as a focal point of such cooperation. I thank all the organizers for giving me the opportunity to speak to you all. So it is one of the good conference that you are conducting, equity and global tax regimes and implications on SDGs. So let it go very successful, and the deliberations of this seminar, let it come as some output to the society and also to our government. Thank you very much, and thank all the organizers, especially Shiv Chittappa, G.S. Prem Kumar, and HR Uma, and all other persons who are behind this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Hemant Kumar, Honorable Vice Chancellor of the Mysore University, and your encouraging words at the end saying that you are ready to extend cooperation in terms of your colleagues and researchers and scientists in the university, because I agree with you also that it is possibly the first time South Center is collaborating with a university in India. And I'm really happy that Dr. Carlos Correa, a very eminent economist and scientist, director of the South Center, is also present with us, as also distinguished speakers. Very fortunate to have Mr. Eric Mensah, co-chair of the UN committee, Mr. Carlos Proto from Buenos Aires, and our two colleagues, Jan Zeb and Abdul Mohit Chaudhry, as well as our Mandya colleagues. And as you rightly said, it's very significant that Rural Center, with the support of our colleagues there, has taken the initiative to do this international seminar. And we know that there are people now from Europe, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and other South countries participating. I'll just take a few minutes as one of the co-organizers to introduce the rationale and objectives of the seminar this evening and explore possible outcomes from the seminar. Before doing that, I'm aware there must be many young students and research scholars and teachers for whom a bit of little history of the South Center is important, for them to be aware of how the South Center emerged. South Center was set up by the South Commission in 1997. During that period, many of us remember, but many young people may not know, that was a period when the countries of the South were under severe pressure from northern industrialized countries, especially through the instrumentalities of the then Uruguay round of GATT discussions, which led to the establishment of the WTO, and structural adjustment programs of the Bretton Woods twins, the IMF and the World Bank, which in a way inaugurated the much appreciated and much maligned globalization. Much was written about at that time, and I myself have contributed many articles in journals, and especially in current affairs publications such as Frontline magazine. And the younger ones in this audience may wish to go back and understand the historical context. The South Commission's first chairman in 1987 was one of our very famous international figures, Dr. Julius Nyerere, Prime Minister of Tanzania. And the first Secretary General of the South Commission was Dr. Manmohan Singh, who also established the South Center and which provided yeoman service to the countries of the South by research and analysis that strengthened their positions in negotiations with industrialized countries. Fortunately, having been at some of the negotiations when it was happening, I could see how smaller developing countries were at a complete loss with the kind of heavy-handedness with some of the negotiations were conducted leading up to the WTO. Today, the South is a more complex reality, 2-3 decades down, and which was recognized in UNDP's Human Development Report of 2013
titled Rise of the South, Human Progress in a Diverse World. The report examined the profound shift in global dynamics by the fast rising new powers of the developing world and its long-term implications for human development. The report identified that more than 40 countries in the developing world have done better than had been expected in human development in recent decades, with their progress accelerating markedly over the past 10 years. The South as a whole produces, as of today, about half of the world's economic output, up from about a third in the late 1980s when the South Commission was set up. It is in this context that the HDR 2013 called for better representation of the South in general governance systems and pointed to potential new sources of financing within the South for essential public goods. I underline public goods. Better representation in global governance is not only about having a place at the table at the Security Council, but perhaps even more important than having a place at the Security Council is to ensure that in matters of global finance and the share in the revenues and finances of the world economy that the world economy generates, there is equity and justice. I need not dwell on the fastest rise in recent years of both income equality and inequality in opportunities, and which in my opinion is one of the major reasons for the social unrest and disturbance to social peace that we see happening in all parts of the world, including in our own midst, in our own country. A key dimension of inequality is that between nations, and more critically, private corporate capital, supported by their governments and global tax regimes, the subject of today's discussions, either not paying their taxes or getting away with lower taxes while their profits continue to rise. Hopefully, we'll have another virtual seminar on this topic. The latter will be dealt in depth by our distinguished speakers and moderators today. The only point I want to make as a development environmental economist is that deepening inequality, the gradual disappearance of justice, both economic and ecological, in national and global affairs, is a matter of serious concern for peace and progress, especially for future generations. It is in this background that TSP Asia and colleagues have felt, especially in the context of sustainability of society in all dimensions, not only ecological, but also environmental, economic, social, and political, hinges crucially on the ability of the state to perform its duties in ensuring the delivery of essential public goods, and for which, as the HDR 2018 pointed out, to possess the ability to finance these public goods. That is the biggest challenge governments today are facing. Therefore, global finance and taxes are subjects that are not just narrow issues for financial economists and revenue specialists, but these are issues that concern the wider world of economics, economists, lawmakers, and those engaging in public policy. They deeply and urgently concern all of us and our current well-being and that of future well-being. The global public health crisis caused by the pandemic that has brought that latter fact to governments and citizens alike in a manner we never imagined. For us to make our governments become more vocal and assertive in matters of global tax justice, in ensuring equity in the global economic relations, in making especially global private capital more accountable, we need to be equally better informed, we as economists in each of our areas. Only then we can ask for greater accountability in the role of not only our governments in these matters, but also institutions of global governance, such as the United Nations, which we need more than ever before, though in matters of global economic governance, the general perception is that the UN economists are missing, silent, or absent. It is in such a context and background that we appreciate the work of the South Center. And this small initiative that we've all taken together from a village center to National Economic Association and an intergovernmental center in Geneva, we hope will empower ourselves as academics with a view to empower our people and fulfill our duties to all our citizenry and bring academic institutions and their work closer to the pressing realities of today, and thus do our small contributions to the common man. It is also why I'm particularly happy that the Indian Economic Association has taken the initiative to be fully part of this endeavor. And very symbolically, the Economics Teaching Research Center, as I mentioned earlier, in a rural area, has joined hands to chart out a vigorous new agenda for research and teaching, and all of which are needed to reach the UN SDGs. We've already almost 5 years into the UN SDGs. We have only 10 years left, and we need to see if we have to have further progress, how we can take it happen, and that accountability and partnerships are very important. We are losing time in the world as the clocks of ill health, poverty, injustice, and climate keep ticking every minute, making the future very precarious to reverse the clock. So it is very important to reverse the clock and look at more hopeful futures and scenarios. We need such collaborations for the future, from the village to the national to the global, wonderfully represented in today's seminar, and from which I will not detain you further. And I'm sure we will have positive outcomes at this workshop, at this seminar, and from it. Thank you very much for all our resource persons. I now hand over the responsibility of moderating the seminar to two of the real experts in the seminar, Jan Zeb Akhtar and Abdul Mohit Chowdhury, both who worked on international tax issues, to moderate, because this is a very substantial issue, which we will learn. And we're asking two of the experts to moderate and hand over the moderation to them. Thank you very much. And one more just announcement. Those of you who want to ask questions or you questions pop up as the speakers go on, kindly put it in chat box. You all are very well aware we have close to 700 participants. So for this particular seminar, we will not be able to have direct participation in asking Q&A. The moderators will pick up some of the best questions or important questions and address it to the speakers concerned. Our colleagues at the Mandya Center and myself and others will make sure we'll collate the chat box questions. We'll put it together, and Mr. Abdul Mohit and us are already planning a report of the seminar, and we'll see how to integrate it and follow up with you, because we do plan at least one or two more linked seminars to this particular seminar. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Surendra, for that wonderful overlay to the discussions which we would be having today in the seminar. I would like to also thank you for giving the background to the work of the South Center and the linkages between the local, the national, and the international, because these are all really building upon each other and are mutually interlinked. Part of the effort behind today's webinar is to really take the issue of taxation beyond the narrow confines of auditors, accountants, and lawyers and chartered accountants, and make it a broad-based discussion, especially involving the academic community and the very important role which teachers play, and talking about how this is an issue which is really ultimately about financing development. So with that, I would like to begin my presentation. I have a PowerPoint which I had prepared, which would focus on the second part of this presentation, which is the implications of the Sustainable Development Goals, because the rest of the speakers would really be elaborating upon equity in global tax regimes. So we would start, I would like to start by looking at this issue of implications for the SDGs, because ultimately this is why we are conducting this entire exercise in international tax reform, so that we can finance money for the Sustainable Development Goals. So as per our latest research from the UN, the developing countries are, so these are graphs on global GDP, investment, and trade growth, and all of them are actually going down, and this is of 2019 data. So the latest data for 2020 hasn't yet come, but we can expect that this would drop much further. So the economic situation is not very nice. Even for the developed countries, it's been on a steady decline. And this has very severe ramifications for our human development indicators, because this is now the first time since 1990, when the Human Development Index first began to be compiled, that we are actually going to see a reversal. And this is a very, very unfortunate development, because it really means an erosion of hard-won hard-won gains. Okay, I'm not sure who is doing this. Can the hosts please please remove this? Yeah, thank you. So yeah, so that also reflects in the figures we are seeing about 100 million people who are expected to go back into extreme poverty. Around 270 million are expected to face acute food shortages by the end of this year. Around 400 jobs have been lost in the second quarter of 2020 as compared to 2019. And the fiscal response, which has come from central banks, mainly in the global north, which have been printing money through buying bonds, has really been concentrated in the rich countries. 88% of the 11 trillion global fiscal response has come from the developed countries, and only 2.5% has come from emerging and developing countries. So we see a very uneven playing field on the impact of the sustainable development goals for the developing countries. And this also has implications, because now the external sources of financing the sustainable development goals are all drying up. If you look at this figure over here, this is basically data on foreign direct investment. We see a steady decline from 2015, when in 2019 it really plummets, and after the COVID pandemic we are expecting to see it go much lower, and pickup is expected only towards 2021, though this is also quite an optimistic forecast. So financing from foreign direct investment is not really looking too encouraging. I request the hosts here to please undo that. And this is basically data on income from customs, which are tariffs on exports and imports. So we see that from 2002, it has been on a steady decline. And this has also been compounded by free trade negotiations, which over time have been reducing tariff barriers, leading to reduced revenue from customs. And in 2018, we had seen it plummet. And after the COVID pandemic, we can expect this to really turn negative, actually. So even revenue from customs has actually gone down. This last graph here is revenue from, is not really revenue. This is financing from overseas development assistance, which aid flows basically. And these are different ways of indicating and measuring ODA financing. But we see that even here, the overall trend is essentially downwards. And again, this is data as recent as of 2017. But if we account for data in the post-COVID scenario, again, we can safely expect that ODA flows are also going to hugely plummet. So what that basically means is that countries now have to rely upon raising money from taxes to finance the COVID recovery. And this is basically a domestic exercise, because from external sources, as we have seen, we cannot really expect much. And here the real focus has to be on the taxation of the digitalized economy, who are the real winners of the crisis. We see the tech giants, Amazon, Apple, Alphabet, which is a parent company of Google, Microsoft, and Facebook, all have seen an increase in revenue during the first 6 months of 2020, which is basically when the pandemic has hit. So international taxation is more important now than ever, and specifically international taxation of the digitalized economy. And these are also the two topics which our resource persons will be speaking about. But before we get to them, we would really now look at the key role played by taxation and international taxation in general for financing the Sustainable Development Goals. And with that, I would hand the floor over to my co-moderator, Ms. Jahanze Bakhtar. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Registered. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Still close to.
Ma'am, I think your screen, it's on
mute.
Yes.
Am I audible now?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, yes.
Okay. So when you hear Abdul and you understand that taxes are the way forward, you also need to understand why I love Alice in Wonderland. Growing up, I was reading a lot of Lewis Carroll, Alice in Wonderland. and imagining that little girl running down the rabbit hole and disappearing into a mysterious world. As a tax administrator of a developing country government, working for a sovereign government, one has these decades of experience with taxes vanishing down some rabbit hole. Now, where are they vanishing? And what is it that we can do with that little magnifying glass, that inadequate basket of skills that developing countries grapple with in trying to retrieve lost tax revenues? Apologies, Lewis Carroll, apologies, Alice in Wonderland. The taxes that are disappearing, they somehow make me feel like the Cheshire Cat. You remember that famous line, I have seen a cat without a grin, but a grin without a cat? Well, I have seen in my decades as a tax administrator, profits, huge multinational profits in the files. But profits without taxes, where have those taxes disappeared? I have seen massive cases of high net worth individuals, the really rich, the really powerful, the really wealthy. But all that wealth, all that income, all those assets, without taxes being paid, where did the taxes disappear? And I have also seen illicit financial flows that came out of illegitimate gains of funds, obviously not tax paid income, not legitimately earned revenues, and definitely with multiple strands of, very dirty stories around terrorist financing, around corruption, about illegalities of multiple hues, all of which gives you an idea that when taxes disappear, the revenues, the cash, the hidden wealth, where does it finally land up? And therefore, you look at an entire global architecture built around secrecy, built around nefarious interlinkages of financial institutions, banks, funds, private equity, big-time consultants, and complicit governments, which create so-called tax havens, the offshore financial centers. And you can see that in that little cartoon are just the US companies and the taxes that they have leached away, hidden away in tax havens. Very famous names, Ireland, Netherlands, Luxembourg, Bermuda, Cayman Islands. Now even a young high schooler knows the names of tax havens. Well, that is where your money is parked. Money that could have benefited developing countries, emerging economies in their battle, not just for the SDG goals, but now for a post-COVID recovery, which is going to kind of almost double or triple our requirement of public funds. That nebulous, that kind of opaque, dark underbelly of global finance has had some lucky leaks. Once in a while, you've heard of things like Paradise Papers, Panama Papers, where millions of documents have come out from law firms, from other investigative results, showing how the rich and powerful have hidden their stash in these secrecy jurisdictions. And why do they require secrecy? Because these are jurisdictions which do not levy any tax, or almost zero to maybe a couple of single-digit figure rates of taxation. In those nil or low tax jurisdictions, the wealth that legitimately ought to have remained in the developing countries from where value was created, from where resources were used, from where skills were employed, taxes were not paid in those countries. Instead, taxes have escaped to jurisdictions through mechanisms of tax evasion, tax avoidance. And it's not just individuals or big players. In the earlier cartoons, you would have seen Queen Elizabeth and U2, Bono. Wait, let me see. Yeah, that is U2, that is Queen Elizabeth, and addressing Bono of that music band U2. These are big names. These are even bigger names. These are all the multinationals, most of them headquartered in the West, in the rich developing countries, many of them headquartered in the United States of America. And hence it gives you a sense of how the international financial structure, the tax regime, the rules of tax interplay are so skewed against the developing countries because they work out of secrecy. There are some improvements in recent years, some fledgling transparency gains have been made because the countries have been, kind of really shouting themselves hoarse. So some sharing of financial transactions have happened, but it's only fledgling because it is not publicly shared. It is government to government, quiet channeled shared, which may help a tax administrator perhaps do a slightly better job, but it will definitely not allow civil society, academicians, young students, researchers to access any data which they can analyze and arrive at conclusions of massive tax evasion by those who have the wherewithal to pay tax. What a skewed world we live in. Those who can pay tax do not pay tax. And those who require the tax are the ones whose tax base is being completely leached away through harmful tax competition. This is really slide down to beggary because developing countries in that miasma of competing for foreign investments are competing themselves out of tax existence because they're lowering the tax rates unrealistically. There are declining corporate tax rates. And to fix all this, the world community sat down, not together, but through the agencies of the richer countries. There is an Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development, a body called the OECD. It is like, it's like the club of the rich, 37 powerful economies of the world, a couple of the less powerful also there for tokenism. They are the ones who decide who will be taxed, how they will be taxed, how the global financial taxation rules will be written. And therefore, we come really to the heart of why this seminar is needed. If there have been 600 registrations, as someone was mentioning in the beginning, I really think we require to do this 100 times over because the message has to resonate at civil society level. Somehow this notion has, got floated around that taxes are technical, taxes are boring, taxes are numbers, taxes are just crude law. We can't understand taxes. When I speak to my 19-year-old who's sipping a Starbucks and I tell her that Starbucks is one of the biggest tax evading MNCs in the country, she starts out by maybe rolling her eyes. The typical teenage response to, oh, this mother is forever ranting. But when you take her into those arrangements, the complex arrangements of the world, the global financial rules, that these MNCs are supported and facilitated by their own countries so that they can continue to use developing country bases to generate income, to create value, but not to pay taxes, to artificially shift the tax base, take away their profits to jurisdictions which you can call them low or no tax places. You can call them, fancy words, OFCs, offshore financial centers, or you can just plain crudely call them what they are, tax havens, which are created for the rich and the powerful. So who will make the rules? Essentially, I think what Eric will talk about are how these very unfair conditions of the world, why did it reach here? How come it is the OECD, that club of rich countries, which is making tax rules for international tax? Why is it not the United Nations, where all countries have one vote each, which is democratic, which is popular vote based, which is the real legitimate forum for all of us to express our needs and our rule-making capacities fairly? How come the United Nations is not making the tax rules, but the OECD is? Eric may touch upon that. So when you are trying to really recreate a new world, your only weapon is imagination. Again, Cheshire Cat. Again, a very famous line from Alice in Wonderland. And that is because the world has changed unrecognizably. Not just the COVID-related changes, not just a shrinking economy, which they say is worse than what it was in the Great Depression times, but because the rules of taxation that are governing us now were made for a brick and mortar world. They were not even made for a world where Netflix takes up 2 hours of my evening entertainment, where data is sold as a model of economy, where search engines earn money through targeted advertisements. It's a world a couple of decades ago we could not even have imagined, because the world has changed, because, as Abdul pointed out, the profits of those who are in the digitalized economy is rising manyfold. Hence, I think our Carlos, second speaker, will take us through that. Coming to really the end of my introduction to the essential themes, it's no use going back to yesterday, because as Alice says, yesterday was a different person. Post-COVID, today is a different world entirely to be recognized for imaginative creation of fairness-based tax rules. Because if you don't know where you are going, any route can take you there, said the Cheshire Cat. So if you have to pay your fair share of taxes, if you have to understand that tax is not a dirty word, tax is the most legitimate, democratic, and correct source that governments, sovereign governments have to create their schools and hospitals, their health infrastructure, to get their economy back on track, you will understand that without taxes being paid in full, the world is essentially a very unequal, unjust, and unfair place. With this, I will hand over to Eric Mensah, and I think my ending and his beginning will kind of dovetail. Eric, over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and that was good, Janzeb and Abdul. And let me see if I can share my screen. Okay. Okay. Sorry.
Mr.
Yeah. Maybe Abdul, if somebody could share it for me, then yeah. I think I'm having problems with the sharing. Yeah, okay. Thank you very much. Yeah, okay. All right. So thank you so much for this seminar and for the opportunity to share some of my thoughts. Acknowledge the work being done by the University of Mysore and in collaboration with the South Center on trying to bring some equity in the discussions on tax transparency and the current global tax framework. Today, this morning, basically, I'll be dealing with the key issues for developing countries in international taxation. And my discussion today will look in very broad terms some of the issues that developing countries face. And just to say that these are my views developed over the course of my engagement in the international tax arena. And they are my personal views from experience. So we'll take it from there. And before I start the discussions, I want to make the following assumptions as to which countries can be classified as developing countries. So if next slide for me, please, slide 2. Okay, developing countries. You realize that it covers a very wide range of countries at different stages of development. According to experts, you can't have one definition to fit every country. Most developing countries are at different stages of development. And however, there is a broad acceptance with respect to which countries fall into this category of developing countries. It's important to know which who are developing countries, because my discussion is basically on the issues that they face in the international tax arena. Almost all African countries would fall within this definition. And in Asia, probably apart from Japan, Singapore, and South Korea, other countries in the region may be classified as developing countries. India, forgive me if India is a developed country, but I'm just looking at broad definitions. And in most Latin American and Caribbean countries, they are likely classified as developing countries. And for the purposes of this discussion, I will make this assumption that OECD countries are all developed countries. So clearly, they are outside the scope of the challenges I would enumerate and discuss. These may be subject to some disputes and controversy, but I believe the challenges I identify are peculiar to non-OECD countries to a very large extent. And this is not, however, cast in stone. It may sometimes apply to some of them, but basically to a very large extent, most developing countries, non-OECD countries, are faced with these challenges that I intend to look at briefly in this paper. Next slide. So sometimes some of the challenges developing countries face before we discuss the key issues are the fact that they have lower per capita national income. And most economists and tax practitioners agree on this issue. And as a result, they have difficulty in raising domestic revenue. And I believe that the SDGs concentrate on domestic resource mobilization as one of the key pillars. Unfortunately, for developing countries, this is a very difficult proposition in mobilizing domestic revenue. And this is as a result of the very limited pool of taxpayers developing countries are able to identify. In effect, developing countries are forced to concentrate on the few multinationals that operate in their countries and the wealthy individuals who may have more than 70 to 80% of the wealth of that country. However, assessing tax revenue from multinationals enterprises who operate in most developing countries requires international cooperation, since the tax base is basically mobile. And you realize that the interests of countries, both developed and developing, do not align. The question we ask ourselves is, why then has the international tax issues taken center stage over the past few years? And I'll send our minds back to the financial crisis. Before 2008, before the financial crisis of 2008, realize that most developed countries were content and actively defended the rules of international taxation. And it was held sacrosanct, the rules of international taxation, by most developed countries. And developing countries were forced to toe the line that, well, this is the rule, or this is the norm for international taxation. Next slide. So some of the issues that I intend to discuss this afternoon or this evening are the international tax rules and framework, the tax competition, the lack of capacity of developing countries' tax administration, and the challenges of the digital economy. So the first part of my discussion will be to look at some of these issues that developing countries face, and the second part will be to attempt to give some suggestions on how to handle these issues and challenges. In my discussions, I would only concentrate on three main areas: the international tax rules and framework, tax competition, and then the lack of capacity of developing countries' tax administrations. With respect to the challenges of the digital economy, my co-panelist and co-member of the UN Task Committee, Carlos, who is highly qualified to do that discussion, will do that and discuss current trends, both in the UN and the OECD, I'm sure. Next slide. The international tax rules and framework, you would realize that the current international tax rules and framework is inherently disadvantageous to developing countries. Why would I say that? As I mentioned earlier on, before the 2008, the developed economies were okay with the international tax rules, and developed countries happily received financial inflows from developing countries. The global tax structure was built to tackle only double taxation to a very large extent, because there were different claims from taxing the same cross-border investment by multinational enterprises. Model tax treaty rules were developed, and these were developed to favor developed countries over developing countries. These rules allocated taxing rights for the different countries who were hosts or who had sources of income, and then the resident jurisdiction of the multinationals. The rules were mainly developed by the developed countries. The OECD had a model tax manual, and then I think the UN to some extent joined the bandwagon. But basically the rules did allocate a disproportionate share of taxing rights to capital-rich states. That is the resident states of the multinational enterprises at the expense of developing countries. And that continued the discussion, that continued the capital flights, even though developing countries were supposedly capital importing countries. In the final analysis, it ended up with capital flight for most developing countries. The end result was impoverished, debt-distressed developing countries. Now, after the financial crisis, what happened? New rules were developed, but these rules were never designed for the benefit of developing countries. And I dare say that the new rules were developed because after 2008, there was a marked reversal of inflows from developing countries in the opposite direction. Wealthy individuals, multinational enterprises now tended to look elsewhere towards the pristine markets of the developing countries as hosts for some of their investments and financial and capital flows. Quickly, developed countries decided that the rules were no longer fit for purpose. And piecemeal attempts at reforms were undertaken by the capital-rich countries. What this entailed was that the new rules were developed to help developed countries continue with their development. It was never designed for the benefit of developing countries. And what made it even more difficult was the fact that certain rules that had been treated as sacrosanct, like bank secrecy, and had been pumped into the heads of most developing countries, were now new rules of engagement that threw bank secrecy out of the window. So new international tax initiatives were employed and were started. However, these new tax initiatives were too complex and were not even practical for developing countries to be able to implement. Developing countries are very much aware of the need to reform the tax systems that currently prevail now in the international or in the global tax arena. However, they are very reluctant to participate in these various initiatives, either because of the complexity of the proposals and the practical difficulties in implementing them, or simply, as I will discuss later on, they lack the capacity to be able to understand the issues being discussed, the speed at which these issues are being discussed, and the ability and the resources to implement some of these new initiatives. Next slide, please. So one other issue that I want to also touch on with respect to this developing country tax, international tax arena is the issue of tax competition. Because of the new rules of taxation that were implemented with respect to global tax transparency, which I would say on the surface of it are good, but not necessarily for the benefit of developing countries, is to compel developing countries to compete for the scarce resources that had ceased to be available to their countries. Competition by itself is for capital investments. It's a good idea. It's a good thing, and I believe that there is no problem with tax competition among developing countries to compete for the capital inflows into their countries. However, the problem is with the overgenerous tax incentives that developing countries are giving out to multinational enterprises. For some countries, according to IMF and World Bank statistics, especially for my country, Ghana, sometimes it can be more than 20 to 30% of GDP loss in terms of tax incentives. So competition has been described and defined by some commentators as a race to the bottom. And this literally erodes the tax base of most developing countries because capital is imported into the country for development. General tax incentives ensure that no taxes are paid, or if any taxes are paid at all, the most minimum corporate income taxes are paid. Sometimes imports and exports duties are exempted, withholding taxes are exempted, and multinational enterprises are able to make maximum profits and take them out of the country. So you find that developing countries are faced with this dilemma, whether to continue to provide general tax incentives to multinational enterprises or to introduce strict domestic tax regime. But it's difficult because this is a competition with other developing countries, and sometimes with some developed countries who are intent on capturing the cross-border investment markets. And you will agree that capital is highly mobile in these current international systems. Unsurprisingly, the BEPS actions plans did not directly address the international tax competition issues, although Action 5 on harmful tax practices indirectly targeted tax competition by seeking to prevent preferential regimes that provide benefits to geographically mobile business incomes, such as international property regimes, and therefore were a risk for tax avoidance activity. Providing tax incentives for multinational enterprises would end up with governments being unable to counteract tax planning measures that most of these multinational enterprises implement in their dealings with developing countries. And other problems with tax incentives are the fact that sometimes domestic investors and domestic manufacturers are denied these incentives, whilst foreign investors who end up taking most of their revenue out of the country are given the needed incentives. And also for the fact that sometimes some of these incentives are redundant, as one expert said. A lot of the investments in the extractive industries especially would take place whether there were incentives or no incentives. But because of this race to the bottom and the over generous tax incentives available, you find that developing countries are forced to grant these incentives. it is important that this issue of tax competition, this race to the bottom, be addressed by developing countries to be able to ensure that they are able to mobilize domestic resources to aid in their development. Next slide. Next slide. And another issue of importance in the international tax arena for developing countries is capacity constraints. Capacity constraints is an issue because of developing countries' inability to engage meaningfully in ongoing discussions to reform the international tax rules and a framework. The lack of capacity makes it impossible for developing countries to effectively respond to international tax issues and to undertake initiatives to address some of these issues. You find out most developed countries do not face some of these obstacles. Many developing countries often lack adequate international tax provisions in their domestic tax legislation and a clear understanding of how these provisions work, even if they do have those provisions. Even where the rules are adequate, the inability to understand these rules and how they interact with international tax norms is a problem. And developing countries often also lack the capacity to administer the international tax rules that are imposed upon them by the international tax institutions that have sprung up in recent times. And also the inability to audit and properly monitor the multinational enterprises' activities. Tax authorities in developing countries often find it difficult to build and maintain capacity across all tax areas. And so it is very difficult to be able to effectively raise revenue. And also importantly, the fact that there's a confluence between international tax rules and domestic tax legislation and the ability to understand the dynamics of the two. Sometimes the inability to understand some of these new tax initiatives may not be directly the fault of developing countries because the rules are developed with such speed and with such haste that it is almost impossible for developing countries to be able to wrap their heads around some of these rules. I think it started with the exchange of information. Exchange of information, I have said in some other fora, it's a very good principle. BEPS is also good, but these are developed for developed countries. They were never meant to help developing countries. The rules are developed quickly, speedily, and with utmost complexity. Developing countries can't understand the complexity of it. Can't, even by the time they're able to understand the basics, the rules have changed. So this lack of capacity is a very major issue that developing countries need to address. Without the ability to understand how norms are being developed and how they are being implemented, developing countries will always play catch up and it will always be to their detriment. So it is important for developing countries to, first of all, modernize their tax administrations and to ensure that they have developed the necessary capacity to be able to understand the rules and to be able to meaningfully contribute in the development and discussion of the new rules of international tax. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. And with respect to the challenges of the digital economy, this is a well-known issue that has taken a center stage for the past 2 years. But I only mention it as one of the key issues of international tax confronting developing countries. But we'll leave it to Carlos to do that discussion when he takes over. So I'll go to my last slide, the conclusions. There is therefore the clear need, in concluding, for the current tax rules and framework to be reformed. The reform options chosen should recognize that developing countries face different realities from developed countries. Options need to be developed that takes account of the legal obstacles to reform in developing countries and the limited administrative capacity that developing countries have. There's also the need to also develop options that are not complex. In designing a response to current global tax challenges, it is important that the global community, both developed and developing countries, understand that no universal solution can be developed. We need to have very simple, effective solutions designed to cater for the various different stages of development of the different countries. It is counterproductive and inimical to the interests of developing countries that new international tax institutions are created without their active inputs, and then they are subsequently invited to join these organizations, or sometimes compelled to join these organizations to give it a stamp of approval to hastily designed and politically expedient rules. See, one of the mantras of some of the new global tax institutions is the fact that we are all equal at the table. And my short answer to that is the fact that the table is set, the menu is prepared, and then you are invited sometimes to stand behind the participants who are on the table, and yet you're supposed to be equal at the table, where you do not take part in developing the institution in the first place. You do not engage in a meaningful discussion of the issues, and you are not able to understand the norms that are being developed. It is impossible to state that you are equal at the table. Developing countries also need to respond to the challenges individually or collectively by strengthening their regional tax institutions so as to protect their tax base without expecting that their tax base and their interests will be taken care of by any international body, however so-called. I know the UN is doing a lot of work in these areas, but it is constrained by the same constraints facing developing countries, resources, and the fact that it is a bigger body that incorporates both developed and developing countries. So competing interests make it very difficult for the UN to be able to assist developing countries as it ought to, though I know that efforts are being made to do that. You may say that I'm a little biased on that score, but I know the challenges the UN face, and yet it does try to project and to speak for developing countries. It's not easy, but it's some work that the UN is doing. Also, it's important that developing countries are cautious in entering into new multilateral organizations or tax organizations, or even entering into new tax treaties, and also to take care of looking back at their old treaties and seeing how these treaties have aided in eroding their tax bases. It is important to have clear treaty policies by developing countries and to have clear policy as to which countries to enter into tax treaty negotiations with. It is important that developing countries do not unnecessarily cede their resources or their tax base to the developed countries through the issue of global tax transparency in the in new international institutions for which they are unable to even understand its effects on their current resource mobilization projects in the future. It is important to understand all these issues before getting involved. The standards that are being set in the international arena are very high standards. Most developing countries are unable to meet those standards and always will falter when they are being peer reviewed. So it's important that developing countries are cautious when entering and engaging in some of these bilateral or multilateral institutions to ensure that they truly understand what is involved and they understand the implications for their resource mobilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mensah, for that masterful overview of the key issues in international taxation for developing countries. And I really want to thank you for your frankness and your candor in speaking so clearly about the challenges which are faced by the developing countries. You have raised so many points, but I especially want to thank you for raising this point of developing countries being very careful about the international agreements they enter into, whether they are tax treaties where they are forced to give up taxing rights often in their negotiations. And for the participants, Mr. Eric Mensah was the chief treaty negotiator in Ghana. So he is really speaking not just from his experience as a co-chairperson of the UN Tax Committee, but also from his experience in his own country. And I also want to thank you for the point you made about these multilateral agreements where developing countries are facing a very difficult turn when it comes to being peer reviewed because of the standards being set at such a high level that it's very difficult for them to live up to them. And I also really appreciate your analogy of the table, where the menu is already prepared and everything is ready, and there's this farce going on of everyone being equal at the table. So it was a really magisterial overview, actually. And some of the participants here are from G77 delegations, are tax officials. I really hope that this advice, which is coming from somebody who has had such excellent experience at such high levels of authority, is taken very seriously, because this is really words of wisdom for developing countries. So thank you very, very much, Mr. Mensah, for that presentation. And with that, where your presentation has ended, we would move on to the next speaker, another leading voice of the developing countries within the UN Tax Committee and within the OECD's inclusive framework as well, Mr. Carlos Prato, who is representing Argentina within the inclusive framework and is a very vocal member of the UN Tax Committee, especially when it comes to the discussions of the taxation of the digital economy on topics such as automated digital services and the taxation of royalties. And he would share with us really some of the key overviews for how the redistribution of taxing rights is taking place through the proposals which are being under discussion in the UN and the OECD, and how these taxing rights can be redistributed to the global south. So without further ado, Mr. Carlos Prato, I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Abdul. Many thanks for the opportunity you gave me to be here, being part of this seminar. Thank you for the organizers of this event, the South Center, the Sustainability Platform, the University of Mysore, and the Indian Economic Association. It's a pleasure for me to be here, and I will do my best to keep up with the expectancies. My precedent speakers have set very high the bar, so I will do my best. I will now share my screen. I have some slides for you to follow my intervention. So what we are going to address now is how tax policy may be designed in a way that it may help to raise a revenue that is also a relevant factor to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals and the 2030 agenda. So moving to the next slide, I will address a couple of thoughts on what the importance of the taxation plays as a role for achieving those SDGs through resource mobilization. I will also address something that has previously mentioned by other speakers regarding how inefficient the current tax system is in order to address highly digitalized multinationals that, as already mentioned, they derive so many profits without paying the fair share of taxes. At the end, I will address different scopes and approaches to address this inefficiency. There is the initiative by the OECD G20 Inclusive Framework on BEPS, and on the other hand, developments undertaken by the UN Tax Committee. So moving into the importance of taxation, I would say that it is very relevant element to design a promotion of economic growth. Not only it allows states to to increase revenue and collect resources that may allow to design and implement growth-driven policies that may contribute to mobilize resources in the achievement of the SDGs, but also they have a direct impact on those SDGs, since they may help to reduce poverty, to reduce inequalities, and making a more level play field for everyone. So there is a direct and indirect participation of taxation on the way states and governments address their plan and their agenda towards sustainable growth and all SDGs. But unfortunately, this tax system is a little bit obsolete. There is no longer that level being the same level for everyone. So not all MNEs are paying their fair share of taxes, since new mechanisms, new tools and technologies allow them to derive income from remote participation. The market is no longer reached through physical presence. So this remotely participation allows them to derive income without paying the right share of taxes in the market jurisdiction from which they are deriving that income. That prevents states, on the one hand, to address equality, that's one of the SDGs, but also it also deprives them from resources from achieving other SDGs. That's the way the governments may finance and support their agenda and their strategy towards SDGs. So what is about the inefficiency of the current tax system? And what we can say is that multinationals, without that physical presence, are not paying taxes. But why is that? Just because the current standard, which has been developed at the end of the 19th century, is no longer valid, because the standard from taxation on non-residents is the physical presence. Is there any format of permanent establishment or any other presence? No, there is no more. So there is a lack of nexus that allows jurisdictions to tax income derived by those MNEs that benefit from the remote participation and engagement with the market. So that there is need for the development of new paradigm, a new tax system that is not based on physical presence, but on something else that create nexus with the jurisdiction from which they are deriving income. So what is something important to understand here is what is the problem. So the problem, I may say, that is not only the local legislation of those jurisdictions that are no longer able to tax MNEs, but is the barrier or the problem that double tax agreements introduced here. So nowadays, and for the last couple of years, many jurisdictions have introduced specific taxes, new taxation that levy a tax obligation for MNEs without the physical presence. So if they have done so, they may have noticed that if they have a tax treaty with the relevant state where the MNE is located or based and is a resident in that state for the purpose of that particular double tax agreement, they will be prevented from applying a digital, for instance. So the problem is that the current tax treaty network prevents taxation because there is a requirement there that, according to Article 7 of all the models, there is a need for a permanent establishment to which profits have to be attributed in the state of source, the market jurisdiction, in order to allow taxation in that particular state. So new business models relying on technology and digitalized business models don't require that physical presence, and they are deriving income anywhere. So the reason is that if you want to implement or apply your domestic legislation introducing a digital service tax, you need to modify your tax treaty network in order to make that tax being applicable. Otherwise, in the absence of physical presence, you are still stuck with the old paradigm, and you are no longer exercising the new legislation that aims to tax all non-residents equally, to tax all service providers in the same way, trying to be equal, which is one of the tax principles. So by that, you no longer are producing a tax policy that is in line with SDGs, but on the other hand, you are no longer collecting resources that may help you to address any other SDGs. So there is a need for a change, and that's the reason why with many scandals, many court decisions denying taxation in some states, there was an increased political pressure to solve this issue. That's why at the beginning, the G20 mandated firstly the OECD to develop new standards. That was the BEPS project, base erosion and profit shifting. So between 2012 and 2015, a new tax policy was designed, but nevertheless, Action 1 failed. So there was no solution on what was called a need for a better taxation for MNEs deriving income from digitalized business models. So even though the others BEPS action plan recommendations were introduced since the years 2016, there is a need to still solve the issue of digitalized business models. That's why the G20, under the Sherman presidency in 2017, asked explicitly the inclusive framework for the implementation of BEPS, that is a body that integrates 137 members. Not all of them are OECD members, of course. The G20 mandated and required this inclusive framework to provide a solution. So an interim report was presented to the G20 in March 2018 during the Argentine presidency. And that interim report indicated some kind of relevant issues to take into account if a solution was going to be developed. At that time, it was said that there was a high level of reliance on highly digitalized business models. So highly technological enterprises have a lot of reliance on intangibles, and those intangibles allow them to derive the income. That intangibles are also mobile. That's another element to take into account. There is a great level of mobility here. And finally, there is something that was not new at that time. It has already been recognized at the final report of Action 1 in the year 2015, saying that there is that mechanism allow MNEs, multinational enterprise, to have a big scale without mass. That is, to have a big participation in the market without any physical presence. So according to those three elements, the inclusive framework starts developing a new approach to address taxation of profits of multinational enterprises that no longer require physical presence in the market jurisdiction. So since there were too many approaches and proposals by different members of the inclusive framework, there was an idea to have a solution based in two pillars. One of them is what we are talking about, is just new rules to address this lack of physical presence to perform an activity and derive income. So pillar one aims to settle new nexus and profit allocation rules. Nexus because there is no longer physical presence, and profit allocation rules because according to current standard, that's the transfer pricing rules, the principle based on the arm's length is no longer valid to determine how many or how much of the profit should be allocated to different entities, and also to different states where those entities are carrying on activities. So that's all about, that's the unified approach to establish new rules. I don't want to get into the details of that because that's very complex, but according to the unified approach of pillar one, there will be a new taxing right, which is amount A. That's something new, totally new. There is no longer an entity by entity approach, but a global approach, a new taxation that has to be determined and assessed at the group level. So the multinational enterprise will be considered as only one taxpayer. It has to determine the tax obligation and pay the portion of that obligation in different market jurisdictions where they are deriving the income. So there are new rules to determine where the income is derived from, to determine if the nexus is fulfilled, if there is enough level of engagement at any jurisdiction in order to know if that jurisdiction is able to exercise the taxing right that amount A allows it. So it's very complex. There are a need for segmenting the accountancy and the books of the different enterprises that are part of the multinational group. There is a need to identify which of those entities have already earned the money and to which are going to be relieved from double taxation, because the multinational enterprise is going to pay taxes in different market jurisdictions, but they have already been paying the taxing rights and taxing obligations according to the current standard. So it's very complex, and that's the new taxing right. Some criticism has been arised that it wouldn't increase so much the level of taxation in smaller jurisdictions where the market is not so big in relative terms, according to the entire market or the global market of a particular M&A. Moving forward, we have pillar two, which is no more than remaining BEPS issues that are being addressed. And there is a new interest of having a similar level of taxation all around the world. That's to address the concerns that many tax administrations have, that there is still BEPS risk because some jurisdictions are competing among themselves, lowering even more the level of taxation there in order to attract investment and some kind of mobile assets to be located there. And many other jurisdictions suffer from that because the tax that is not being paid in a highly level jurisdiction, it will be paid or not paid at all in those other jurisdictions that have attracted this investment. So pillar two is there to introduce a minimum level of taxation. And if it is not exercised at a minimum level of taxation, other jurisdictions will be allowed to tax, but no more than that level of taxation. So it's a kind of leveling the type of taxation from corporate activities all around the world. So that will have an impact on low tax jurisdictions that are expected to increase the corporate tax, the effective taxation, at least at the agreed minimum level that would emerge after the work on Pillar 2 is finalized. So that's what the OECD is doing, and I agree with other speakers. We need to know how much equal footing is there, whether all members of the inclusive framework are in the same position to not only raise the concerns, but also to keep up with the level of work. It's increasing, it's very high, the demand that this type of project is requiring from all stakeholders. There are meetings every month for more than one day, from thousands and thousands of pages to read. I think that the blueprints of both pillars are more than 500 pages, but it's not just the photo, it's what is being currently at stake, but to have reached to those 500 pages, many others have to be developed and modified. So it's very demanding for developing countries. Not all of them have the same level of resources to allocate to this kind of project. And that's why I agree with Mr. Mensah that probably they are not there in a position to have an equal footing, to participate and to raise the concerns they may have, and to, why not, influence and bias the way this project is being addressed. So I agree that it is merely driven by that club of rich, as the other speaker mentioned, and it's always the G7 leading with this project, and others are trying to keep up and try to adapt the outcome, at least not to affect their interest at the utmost. So, and that's the reason why another intergovernmental body start providing solutions. But nevertheless, we need an international forum to discuss this, and the UN may also have a say there. Even though there is no one intergovernmental body, the UN Tax Committee is a group of experts acting in their personal capacity, not binding any jurisdiction, but it's a relevant forum to discuss this. The intention of this forum is to provide guidance, and why not establishing new taxing rules that allow jurisdictions to follow, that are all of them focused on taking into account the interests of developing countries. And that's the aim of the UN Tax Committee, to provide guidance to allow developing countries to establish their tax system in a way that allow them to address those SDGs, to be in a position to implement and reach the 2030 agenda in the best way as possible. So the committee of experts are already aware of developments undertaken in other forums, and that's the reason why they understand the solution that is proposed at the inclusive framework level is probably too complex, and it is not making any difference for least developed countries. According to some estimates, revenue collection from Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will be no higher than 1% of current collection on corporate taxation. So that's not what governments in developing countries were expecting from that. And on the other hand, to be in a situation to implement the newly designed solution by the inclusive framework, it will require a lot of administrative burden, and not all tax administrations are in a position to allocate those resources just to implement the two-pillar approach as being developed by the inclusive framework. That's the reason why the members of the Committee of the United Nations are looking for new strategies, new solutions that are not only easy to implement, but also take into account the needs and the necessities of developing countries. So mainly approved by the committee is just to introduce a rule that is in the same instrument than the other rule that prevent taxation at the domestic level. So if domestic legislation addressing taxation for digital services is or are not in a position to be applied because of the tax treaty, it has to be the tax treaty, the one that removes that barrier. And that's why a new Article 12b is being suggested to be introduced in the UN model in order to allocate taxing rights to market jurisdictions wherever there is some type of engagement in that jurisdiction, and the engagement is just payments flowing from that jurisdiction in order to receive digital services. It is specified automated digital services. There is a very close correlation between the unified approach and the UN proposal here as regards the scope. So the same target services are being addressed in order to provide a solution. But the solution is totally different. It just allows the source taxation to implement a withholding tax at a rate that has to be agreed bilateral, like all other measures in the tax treaty. But it also introduced a new element, which is a net basis taxation, depending on the profitability ratio of the MNE that derives the income. It is much more complex than the withholding tax, but it allows not excessive taxation, so it takes into account losses that are carried from the state of residence or of the beneficial owner of the profits. So it will address that situation in order to be more fair in the way the tax system is implemented. So there will be no excessive taxation. So that is the proposal at the United Nations. It's been right now proposed by 14 members, all of them from developing countries. Okay, there is one which is now an OECD member, but at the time we start developing this, that particular country was still a developing one. Of course, and Eric has mentioned, there is a kind of contradiction of different type of interests within the committee. So the committee is composed by 25 members, which were appointed depending on the region and also on the level of development of the country they are becoming. So most members that are coming from developed countries are not interested at all on having any solution. They may probably not be interested at all on having any solution at all. So they have to live with the unified approach, but they don't want to depart from that. And the more level of taxation in market jurisdiction there is, the more amount of taxes has to be released from the state of residence. So that's the kind of fight we normally have between source and residence, and that's the reason why there are opposite interests in this project as well. So most members from OECD countries prefer to keep status quo, while others are interested in moving forward and to allow market jurisdictions to introduce or to apply a newly introduced levy on digital services. So why there is a reason to have a solution? Well, as we have said, if not all taxpayers are paying the right share of taxes everywhere, there will be an inequality situation, which is contrary to SDGs. On the other hand, and explained in the final report of 2015 on Action 1, digitalization exacerbates other BEPS risks. So there is a risk of having more taxes not being paid in the proper jurisdiction, and which is an even worse scenario. It's the taxes are not being paid anywhere. So there is a need to start working on a global solution. On the other hand, if there is no global solution, there will be a proliferation of unilateral measures that will be uncoordinated, inconsistent, and that will affect the entire international tax system. There will be an increasing uncertainty. So certainty is something that is required to promote economic growth, investment. So if the proliferation of unilateral measures are uncoordinated and inconsistent, there will be a real impact in growth and the way states achieve the 2030 agenda. And what are the guiding principles in order to develop a new global solution that fosters sustainable growth and ultimately allows implementing jurisdictions. As you may know, many developing countries are against arbitration or any other type of mandatory and binding dispute resolution mechanism. So tax certainty has to be achieved, but while contemplating the needs of all participants. What else has to be contemplated? The new taxing right, the new nexus and profit allocation rule have to keep an eye on not only predictability, but it also has to be equal to all taxpayers in order to have no inequalities there by design. Another issue that has to be contemplated is how the new rules are being designed, how they are contemplating the needs and capacities of all interested jurisdictions. So I agree with Mr. Mensah that not all tax administration, not all jurisdictions have the same capacities, and that has to be contemplated. One of the interest issues here is the way the inclusive framework is developing the two-pillar approach is apparently not contemplating those interests. It's not easy to keep up the pace here, so there is no real track on what's being under development on the inclusive framework. And many developing countries, even though they are members of the inclusive framework, they are not realizing what concerns they may have at the time of implementing the new rule. That's something that the UN Tax Committee is taking into account. And that's why that tax committee is working, just to have a solution that is easy to implement for all developing countries. At the end, there has to be a new taxing right, which is framed in a consistent manner. So there is a need for a coordinated implementation. And by doing that, that implementation has also need to contemplate the capacities of all jurisdictions. So as we normally say, no one has to be left behind there. Finally, the new taxing right has to increase collection. That's the reason why we are implementing this, not only to provide certainty equality, but also to allow jurisdictions to derive collection on resources to finance and support SDGs that are there to be implemented during the following decade. Finally, what is important to take into account that fairness and equity is something that is important for the new international tax framework. It will allow governments to raise the tax revenue and also may allow to tax sustainable pro-growth strategies. It will also may allow countries and governments to take care of the current pandemic. So there is an increase of expenditure from governments in order to address this pandemic situation, and there is a need for new sources of financing in order to stabilize their figures, the deficits, the fiscal deficits that they are having because of this pandemic situation. So a new tax at the level of market jurisdictions may allow the governments of those jurisdictions to address not only BEPS concerns, but also any related expenditure related to the COVID-19 pandemic and the crisis that has been taking place after this pandemic situation. So there is a need for a recovery, and to finance any recovery, there is a need for new sources of finance. So collection has to be increased in order to address that particular situation. So the consensus-based solution has to provide a business with that particular recovery. So there will be a need for reallocating resources, and that mobilization of resources is crucial for the economic recovery after the COVID-19 pandemic. So that's all. Thank you all for listening to me, and I will be happy to address any concern, question, or doubt that you may want to ask me. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Carlos Proto. That was indeed a great up-to-date messaging about where we are in this digitalized service taxation world. And particularly me, being from the Indian tax administration, and kind of enjoying that little pioneer role in the way we have done our tax legislation, feel a little bit vindicated that perhaps the things we have been doing were rightly done. And now that the OECD-led inclusive framework, I have big question marks around how inclusive and how really everyone is able to participate or not. I'm glad you brought that up. So OECD will continue to be OECD. No matter what labels of inclusivity you kind of add on tags to it, it is not for everyone. As a tax administrator, and now when I'm seeing you confirm my worst views, that the two-pillar thing is going to lead to more complexity and not much more revenue gains, I'm quite inclined to think, what have we been doing for the last 2 years and for what purpose? Instead, the whole demand to make the UN as the primary base for countries to convene and decide on going forward, division of the tax base. Somewhere it is my hunch that the time is getting more and more ripe for that. As common tax administrators, for example, like me, are getting a little disillusioned with this whole, I'm afraid to call it circus, but sometimes it seems a little bit like that to me, because it's not leading anywhere which is going to really help developing countries up their tax revenues. India, for example, was the first to levy what we call your 6% tax on the digitized services, equalization levy. you pay. So I'm really kind of trying to simplify, Carlos, what you said, because much of our audience is, students and civil society. So I'm saying it in a kindergarten child's language, as it were, for them to understand that, what we did was, I am booking advertisement services from, let's say, paying advertisement charges to Google. When I make a payment of $100, I deduct 6% and keep it as tax. Equalization levy. Later on, India has also come out with the significant economic presence linkage. Of course, we've been kind of arm twisted into keeping it on hold forever and ever. So it's now gone for the next 2 years. We are not really implementing it. But the thing is, when individual countries take unilateral action, it may not be the perfect thing to do in a multilateral world. Consensus is best. Everyone agreeing and formulating rules is even better. Doing things by mutual consent is the perfect way to go forward. But are we really able to do that in our present platform of inclusive framework? Because I have strong doubts. Maybe India is a better resourced country. Maybe its tax administrators can, understand the law, speak the English, and go through those 5,000 pages of documents and digest it. But I can't imagine many smaller, poorly resourced tax administrations able to do even 10% of that. So have we started a fair process, or have we continued the unfairness under the garb of inclusiveness, so-called, is my biggest doubt. So I saw a lovely question from Alex Cobham, Tax Justice Network, saying, please, Carlos and Eric, give your thoughts to whether, is this the forum to move forward in, or should we kind of say quits, enough is enough, let us go back to what FACTI panel said, ask the UN to call for a new convention, all countries sit across, everyone has their say, and we decide the rules. Because I would like the lay audience here to be up to date on the global power play. United Nations Tax Committee, of which the two speakers here today are, one is a member, one is a co-chair, big people. But they are not representing their countries there. It is not an intergovernmental body, like say the biodiversity body is an intergovernmental body in the UN. If they sign off on something, governments are committed to enforce it, implement it. Here they are representing themselves in their individual expert capacity. And the whole resistance from the developed world, from the OECD, directly, indirectly, arm-twistedly, aid-blockingly, you can use a variety of metaphors, has been to see that the UN Tax Committee is not upgraded into an intergovernmental body. 2015, Addis Ababa, the UN held a Financing for Development conference where the resolution to upgrade it to an intergovernmental body came this close to getting passed. I have been privy to, many of the kind of whatever was going on there. Somehow civil society played a very strong role of advocacy, and the resolution almost got passed, except for 2 countries that kind of fell by the sidelines. So the demand to make the UN tax body into an intergovernmental body should be our priority number 1. And that should not be lost sight of in this, newer forums of deliberation, which are kind of looking inclusive, but with my trademark question mark. Sorry, Carlos. Yes.
If you may allow, make a comment, a complement to what you have said. In fact, a new intergovernmental UN body on taxation wouldn't make the difference if resources are not being mobilized in order to properly address any tax issue that is going to be discussed in the newly intergovernmental body. It will be the same as the inclusive framework. At the inclusive framework, 100 or 102 members are not OECD states. Nevertheless, they are acting there in a governmental nature, and they are not able to influence the outcome anywhere. So what we need is not to create an intergovernmental body, but allocate more resources to the tax policy function that deals with the interaction at the international level in order to make the interest of the particular nation being expressed and heard in the relevant forum where those issues are being discussed. So I would like to have a UN tax committee that is a governmental body where there is a more representation of the current scenario. The world is not only 25 states, and not half of the world is an OECD member. So nowadays, half of the UN tax committee of experts are coming from OECD member states, which is unbalanced because they are in a position to work harder. All those members are probably supported by their staff. All of them are also representing their governments at the OECD or any other international tax forum, which is the European Commission, at least for those EU members. So they are in a better position. They are fully staffed and they can make the difference whenever they go for the UN tax committee, because they are half and because they are very well prepared, which is not the case always with all the members that are coming from developing countries. That's a point that I want to make, but I fully support the G27 proposal to make an upgrade and a governmental body for taxation. Thank you.
Abdul, will you please take some of the questions and direct them to the speakers?
Yes, ma'am. But first, I'd just like to ask the University of Mysore if we have any more time for questions, because I see that we're out of time technically.
Abdul, I think it'll take about another 15 minutes. Then we'll take another 5 to 10 minutes to wind up with any practical announcements from our colleagues from the university and any small closing comments that I would like to make in terms of follow-up later after this, which we have been discussing over email, but I think we are getting some picture about what is happening. So we can have about 15 to 20 minutes. 15 minutes is ideal. So please pick up. I saw some very interesting questions, so I'll leave it to the moderators to pick and tell the speakers to address them.
So so
you make practical announcement. Listen to me first. You make practical announcements.
So just to read out Alex Cobham's question in full detail. I know Carlos Prato has already responded to it, but if Mr. Eric Mensah would also
you do the practical announcements, I will do closing remarks.
If Mr. Eric Mensah could also respond to it.
And end.
So the question is,
with you, we'll end the program.
Can we sensibly expect to be able to make the existing instruments and institutions work better to address the clear failure to reduce corporate and individual tax abuse and the inequalities in global taxing rights that result, or do we need to look to new instruments? In particular, it would be valuable to hear the perspectives of speakers on whether it makes sense to continue hoping that the OECD can be more inclusive, or if, as the FACTI panel has suggested, it is now the time to negotiate a UN tax convention. Such a convention could deliver fully multilateral inclusion in tax transparency measures and set the terms for a new UN forum to negotiate tax rules. So that was the complete question. If Mr. Mensah, you would like to comment on that. And another question is
thank you.
It has come from Lakshmi Narayanan, who says we need to find concrete instruments and structured participation in the inclusive framework. What are those instruments and measures? How to find consensus at developing countries level on those measures? And
she'll close.
And once consensus is achieved, we need a strategy to present a unified front towards inclusive framework to address the inequity. So, Mr. Proto, if you would like to address the second question.
What I will do is when he hands over to me, I'll hand over to you.
And Mr. Surendra, you're audible actually. So I request if you could please put it on mute. Yeah.
Niranjan. Sorry, cut my mic. I told him then it's.
Okay, so Abdul, have you finished?
Yes, Mr. Mensah. Yeah, I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Well, with respect to the first question on the UN Tax Committee being upgraded to an intergovernmental body, I tend to agree with Jan-Zeb and Carlos. But more importantly, even with the current tax committee, like Carlos said, even with a little bit of resources, it can do a lot of work. And I must say that in this past 1 year, especially during the COVID period, with developing countries, and especially led by Mr. Rajat from India and Carlos from Argentina, has made tremendous progress in the digital tax space, because this time developing countries are able to more coordinate their efforts and their principles before a meeting, and to be able to hold meetings courtesy by virtual technology. And that has pushed the work forward. What the committee couldn't do in 3 years, with more organization among developing countries, in about 6 months to a year, a lot has been done, and we're hoping that we're able to crystallize the work that has been done by the group. And all boils down to the resources available to the UN Tax Committee. In 2015, the Addis Ababa action agenda failed to upgrade the UN Tax Committee into an intergovernmental body because of the strong opposition from developed countries, with the excuse that there were too many international tax bodies. Immediately after the conference, you have the inclusive framework coming up. And the inclusive framework, even though it bears the name inclusive framework, it's not inclusive in terms of the agenda and the ability of developing countries to input what is being done there. The UN has the capacity to be able to do that if it has the resources. So I fully support an intergovernmental body, because then the true meaning of equal at the table would then be in full force, where you have members representing their countries and able to take decisions that would affect and bind all the countries. But the current membership being an experts appointed in their own personal capacity, and with the kind of resource constraint that we have, it's very difficult to move forward. But I think with the example that has been set this last 6 months, I'm sure that if it continues, we'll be able to achieve even more for developing countries. I know Carlos may have something to say on this, because he's been one of the people the pillars of this kind of new movement that has helped the UN Tax Committee to move forward speedily in 6 months compared to the past 3 years.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. I fully agree. Something has to be changed in order to have an international tax forum in an equal footing. On the one hand, yes, of course, we are in a position to provide during these last 6 months with proposals that are for the interest of developing countries, but that's just, let's say, as a consequence of the current situation. If we were now working remotely from home, I wouldn't have the time to start drafting Article 12B or the new proposal on royalties to cover software. So that's been done during these 6 months because I could find the time to do it. And the same for Mr. Bansal, who is another active member and a co-keeper that allow the developing countries to be represented. We also need to thank this digitalized business model that produces apps that allow us to have, like here, a remote conference being in different parts of the world. So the same type of mechanism allowed the developing country members of the UN committee to start coordinating themselves, to start circulating different drafts and approving and discussing. That has been done during these 6 months because some of us had the time to do it, because not going to the office on the one hand allow us a couple of hours per day, not going to Paris for any OECD meeting once or twice a month also allow us time to have free weekends instead of being with family, to provide something for the UN and also for the OECD as well. But so that's a particular situation. So if normality is recovered, something else has to be done. So we cannot rely on the personal capacity of some couple of members in order to move forward the international agenda for the developing countries. Something else has to be done. I celebrate the G27 strategy and proposal, but it has to be taken seriously. As I said before, more resources has to be allocated. So it's not possible that developing countries has a tax policy department that address international issues being conformed by only 2 or 3 persons, to negotiate tax treaties, to attend OECD CFA meetings, to attend any working party at the OECD level, to keep up an eye on what's going on at the UN Tax Committee, where states are also observer countries. So more resources have to be allocated to this international function if we want a better result for developing countries. That's on that point. Another one is more situations for cooperation among developing countries has to be created. It shouldn't rely on personal interest or personal initiatives to coordinate. You know, Eric, that we are coordinating everything in personal capacity for the UN, but we are also doing the same at the inclusive framework level. So at the steering group that deals with steer the way the inclusive framework works, we are doing the same. Another Indian delegate, Brazilian delegate, and myself are always coordinating through a WhatsApp group, and that's not something that has to be done like that. More institutions should be required to move that cooperation, and not it shouldn't depend on personal initiatives in order to have countries being consistent with their position at the international forum. In order to plan a strategy, something else has to be done by governments and not by personal interests or initiatives. That's something to say. So thank you so much, Eric, for asking me what my views are on this.
Just one last question for the speakers, either of whom would like to take this. Given that developing countries are not at a uniform level of development and that they actively seek foreign investment, can tax competition among them be overcome? This is by Susan George.
I'm not sure that is possible. I think capital is mobile, so developing countries' inability to be able to mobilize domestic resources definitely would go after this highly mobile capital. So it will be difficult to completely eradicate tax competition. I think one way out is to maybe have clear guidelines and rules. The UN Tax Committee, the subcommittee on extractive industry taxation for developing countries, is developing a paper on tax incentives, especially in the extractive industry area, to be able to guide and help developing countries with respect to the kind of tax incentives that they give to multinational enterprises. Where there are clear guidelines and countries commit to follow those guidelines, I think it might minimize the harmful effects of competition, but it will not be able to completely eradicate it. It's not possible to do that, because I think in my presentation, I talked about the differing levels of development among different developing countries. So it is possible to sanitize it, but not to completely remove it. Thank you.
Okay, if there are no further questions, then Mr. Surendra, do we hand the floor back to you?
First, I would like to say e-certificates will be generated by filling the feedback form automatically. Per day, 100 certificates will be generated. Today, already 100 certificates have been issued. Tomorrow, after 24 hours, if anybody interested want to have e-certificates, please fill the feedback form and you will get your certificates immediately tomorrow after 7 p.m. After 24 hours by now. If anybody also not get the certificates tomorrow, because we have more than 700 participants participated in this seminar, 711 participated in this seminar, and every day 100 certificates will be generated. You can fill the feedback anytime. After 24 hours, you will get the certificate. That's one thing. And now I request our co-host Nasir Khan to make some remarks about this seminar. Thank you.
Why is he in such a position?
Just unmute ಮಾಡಿ sir ಅವರು.
ಹೇಳಿ sir.
Kindly unmute me, sir.
Yes, you're unmuted.
You're audible. Thank you so much, sir.
Why is he talking in reverse?
I'm Dr. Nasir Khan, Executive Committee member from Indian Economic Association. So on behalf, am I audible?
You are vertically. Let him speak like that.
ಕೇಳಿಸ್ತಾ ಇದೆಯಲ್ಲ ಸರ್?
ಹೇಳ್ತಾ ಇದೆ, but I think your image ಸ್ವಲ್ಪ vertical ಬರ್ತಾ. You're not, your screen image is
not. Oh, it's okay.
It's okay. Then go ahead.
So at the outset, Indian Economic Association is proud to be associated with South Center Geneva, TSP Asia, Department of Economics, RME, PG Center, University of Mysore, and all other luminaries from the globe. Respected Professor G. Hemant Kumar, Vice Chancellor of University of Mysore, the webinar President, Dr. Carlos Correa, Executive Director, South Center Geneva, our Vice President, Dr. Anil Kumar Thakurji, BP Chandramohanji, Dr. H.R. Uma, local organizing secretary, my friend Shiv Chitappa, Prem Kumar, and the respected speakers of today's webinar, Mr. Eric Mensa, Carlos Proto, and moderators of the session, Dr. Jahanazeb Akhtar, Abdul Mohit Chaudhary ji, Professor Lawrence Surendra, and all the other participants and dear friends. Indian Economic Association is proud that we have collaborated with these centers from across the globe, which have organized an informative seminar on equity in global tax regimes and implications for SDGs. All the speakers have very beautifully presented, and the information that they have given is very helpful to the not only researchers but also to the academic fraternity around the globe. As far as Indian Economic Association is concerned, it is the world's largest and oldest association, which was started in 1917 through a conclave of teachers of economics held in Calcutta, which was convened by Professor C.J. Hamilton. So the period was just after the First World War, and after the First World War, the Indian Economic Association is organizing conferences without a break, and recently we have also concluded the centenary celebrations in 2017. Our association is glad that we have luminaries of economics of the core of Professor Amartya Sen, who is a Nobel laureate and past president, and also he was the past president of International Economic Association. We have Professor Kaushik Basu, who is the president of Indian International Economic Association, was also the president of Indian Economic Association. And we have renowned scholars like R.N. Mukherjee, C.N. Vakil, Gadgil, Neogi, V.K.R.V. Rao, Das Gupta, B.K. Madan, S.K. Basu, Lakhadwala, to name few. There are many. And most notable among them is Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was a two-time president, and our C. Rangarajan was also the past president of our association. We are organizing conferences and academic activities throughout the year. So 103rd conference is going to be held at Jaipur in December 2020. The conference will be attended by more than 7,000 life members, which is actually the largest association in India and also in the world. So with these words, I thank University of Mysore PG Center Mandya for collaborating with us and given us an opportunity to be part of this wonderful webinar. Thank you, sir. Thank you so much.
And Mike Kode. Thank you, Dr. Nazir Khan. Before I hand over the mic for a vote of thanks by Dr. Uma, just a few concluding remarks. We said that this tax regime, inequities in the tax regime, we were discussing in the context of the UN SDGs. And I think in terms of bringing the UN SDGs in my closing remarks, I think we need to look at SDG 16, where we were talking of justice in the global system. And I seem to notice within the UN that many activities are simply overlaid with a label like SDG, and more focus is still on opening up for trade or cross-border cooperation and so on. It's very important, I think, and I mentioned it earlier, that our UN economists take cognizance of this issue, bring it centrally into the agenda of the regional UN bodies like UNESCAP, Economic Commission for Africa, ECLA, and so forth, because this has to become a central part of the agenda. It is not enough if the divisions are taking on. I also think that we need to have the sub-regional organizations like ASEAN and others. I know the ASEAN members are very active on these issues, but I think it's our responsibility to make sure, as Jahan Zeb mentioned, through academic involvement and civil society involvement, to bring it up in the agenda of these discussions, including the Asia-Europe dialogue, which happens every year. And I think civil societies have been very active in the Asia-Europe dialogue. Academics should get involved, because I think it's not just enough for NGOs, but also academics should get involved in these forums and do it. And powerful countries like India should do more than wanting a place in the UN Security Council. Yes, that gives us prestige, but I think we have a large responsibility to the developing world as one of the founders of South Commission, as a very active participant of the G77, to do this. And I ask all the participants who participated today to make sure that that becomes a major agenda in our national debates and discussions, because many of these are falling aside on the wayside in the whole obsession with COVID. And lastly, it's very good that Dr. Nazir Khan mentioned that the next Indian Economic Association will be held in Jaipur. I implore him and I request him to have a special session on the questions of inequities in the tax regime and make sure that our academicians, our universities are involved. I've been having discussions with my two good friends and colleagues, Dr. Uma and Dr. Prem Kumar, saying that we should immediately try to include in the economic syllabus at the MA level, and we've already decided we'll work on it, on this particular issue, and make more and more of our students and others aware of these issues, and not leave it purely to our foreign service people and our tax administrators and others to do it. It is as much a citizens' issue as it is the issue of member states. So I really thank, I don't know how much to thank Abdul and Jahanzeb and the South Center for putting together this wonderful seminar and helping us with it. We've been following the feedback. It's been extremely positive. We'll go back. And to the participants, we just want to tell you that any assistance you need in terms of curriculum development, resources, and others, we, the organizers of this virtual seminar, will do our best to make sure what is discussed is integrated into mainstream teaching, mainstream research, and dissemination to the larger public. Thank you again, and I please hand over the mic to our good friend and colleague, Dr. Uma, to say the vote of thanks.
Thank you, sir. Hello and namaste to all my friends. We had been a very wonderful discussion today, and it's my privilege to have proposed a vote of thanks on this occasion. So on behalf of all the 4 organizing institutions and on my own behalf, I would like to extend a very warm vote of thanks to all the patrons, the resource persons, moderators, conveners, organizing secretaries, and dear participants. So as we went through this webinar, Dr. Carlos, Executive Director, South Center, Geneva, who presided over this webinar and delivered a very valuable, thought-provoking presidential remark. I would like to wholeheartedly thank him for his presidential remark. Thank you, sir. I would like to thank profusely our beloved Vice Chancellor, Professor Hemant Kumar, University of Mysore, for his encouragement and support to all these webinars which are happening in the university, and also for his inaugural address in this webinar. Thank you very much, sir, for your support, and you are an inspiration to all of us. I would like to thank Professor Anil Kumar Thakur, the chief convener, and also his team from IEA for their continuous support in organizing and performing the webinars throughout the country. Thank you, sir. My dear friend Nazir Khan, who has been there to represent IEA troop, I wholeheartedly thank him for his support in this. Thank you, sir. As you see, this international webinar was introduced to you by Professor Lawrence D'Souza, Professor Surendra, and moderators, Madam Akhtar and Abdul Chowdhury. Madam was very bubbly, and she has first-hand information as Principal Commissioner of Income Tax. We really enjoyed her practical experiences, and we do have interest in having her once again on such international webinars, Madam. We really enjoyed your speech, and thanks for being a part of this and for inspiring us to think in this direction. We know that poverty anywhere is a threat to prosperity, and now it is time for all the developed countries to think about this to achieve the sustainable development goals. Equity in global tax regime is one of the highly debatable topics right now, along with COVID. So I thank both the moderators for having a wonderful, lively discussion in this webinar. Thank you, both of you, ma'am and sir. And coming to the main part of this, we had 2 wonderful speakers, Mr. Eric Mensah and also Mr. Carlos Proto. Both of them have they are think tanks in this particular field. They shared their views regarding this tax-related issues, global tax regime, and how they are very important for sustainable development goals to achieve. I thank both of them for their lucid presentation and for making us to think over all these issues once again as academicians. Thank you both for your presentation and lively discussion. Thank you. And in this webinar is very successful, mainly because of the personal interest and effort taken by the organizing secretaries, Professor Prem Kumar and Professor Shivchitappa, and also another one, Dr. Nazir Khan from IEA. And without whose personal effort, this wouldn't be a successful webinar. I thank them and congratulate them for the success of this webinar. Thank you, sir. And the technical staff of University of Mysore has been there as part of this webinar, and they have coordinated so well that we really felt like we never created any problem throughout this webinar. I congratulate them for their success and also thank them for being a cooperative group to us. Thank you so much. And above all, last but not the least, the participants have exuberantly responded to this webinar. We expected something like 300, 400 registrations, but the registrations were up above 800, and almost all the registered candidates have participated in this webinar. They were with us throughout the webinar, participated and actively responded with their questions. And it's really a wonderful experience to be here and to see the voluminous response from all over the world to this webinar. I thank them wholeheartedly and request them to be with us throughout such webinars, which are going to be conducted from University of Mysore in collaboration with these institutions. I thank all of you, those who are directly and indirectly responsible for this webinar to be successful, the director of Mandya PG Center and my colleagues from the center for their coordination and cooperation to see this success of this webinar. Thank you one and all. Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jahazeb ma'am, and thank you very much to Mr. Carlos Prato and to Mr. Eric Mensah for their really fantastic presentations.
Thank you.
Thank you, madam.
Thank you. Great experience. Thank you, Eric and Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Look forward to Carloses to thank. Carlos Correa and Carlos Proto. Yes. So double thank you.
Both from Argentina.
We look forward to the next seminar.
Okay, Abdul.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Abdul. Good job.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, sir.